Okay, this video is on midpoint and the midpoint formula. Well, midpoint in itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's halfway in between two other points. So let's say I have a point here and a point here. Let's call it A and B. Halfway in between, maybe it's right about here. So this would be the midpoint. Let's call it M. So the midpoint between A and B would be half the way, half the distance. And if it was a line segment, this would be the same distance. The distance from M to B would be equal from M to A. And that's why it's marked congruent. These hash marks here, they mean that they're the same distance, the same measure, they're equal. If they had had a different marking, let's say they had two hash marks, well, now the way it's written, this is a different measure than that one. But if they both had two, now they're back to being equal. So most of the time they only write one hash mark unless there's more than one pair of congruent segments, in which case they would need to have different markings. But as long as they have the same markings, then you know that they are the same measure. So let's just make sure we're really clear on this. Let's say we have C and D and we have a midpoint. Let's call it M again. So if this side is 10 and this is truly a midpoint, then this side would also have to be 10 and the entire distance would have to be 20. And then once we know, of course, that this is the midpoint, we can mark them congruent. This would be 10 as well as that would be 10. They're equal. So you could write it in a congruent statement. You could say line segment MD is congruent to line segment CM. And you can say that about up here too. Line segment AM is congruent to line segment MB. You could also say that the measure of line segment MD is equal to the measure of line segment CM. And notice the difference here. In this one, I use the line segment notation because I'm talking about congruency. And the second one, I don't use the line segment congruency because I'm talking about equal measures. So I'm going to write this in words. This one says line segment MD is congruent to line segment CM. That's how you say that out loud. Line segment MD is congruent to line segment CM. I'm going to draw like a line here so we can separate these. This one, when you speak this one out loud, it says the measure of line segment MD is equal to the measure of line segment CD. So notice the difference here. This one we're talking about numerical value. We're talking about 10 equals 10. And that's why we're talking about the measure. So the measure, like how long the line segment is it 10 inches, 10 centimeters, 10 miles? We don't know. We didn't mark it like that. But the measure of the line segment is equal to the measure of the other line segment. They're equal. But up here, we're talking about congruency. So line segment MD is congruent to line segment CM, which congruent means equal as well. But just know that there's different ways to write it. And because you wrote it differently, you say it differently. Okay, Now, midpoint in itself is a really easy concept. It only becomes difficult when it's done on the coordinate plane. So, ooh, that was bad. Sorry, that really got caught. So let's draw ourselves a coordinate plane. And we have the y-axis and the x-axis. And let's say we'll just do 5 hash marks on each axis. Okay. And I have a point. Let's put a point here, and let's put a point here. All right, now the midpoint between these two numbers, these 2 points, that becomes a lot harder because they're not on a straight line, like, you know, a horizontal line or a vertical line. Now it's a diagonal line, and it becomes a lot harder to really be able to pick out, oops, that's a really bad line. It's really hard to be able to pick out where the midpoint would be. So this is where we use the midpoint formula. First thing we have to do is figure out what the coordinates are. So this one is over 2 and up 3. So 2, 3. And the second point is over 1 and down 1. So -1, -1. Now, the midpoint formula says that you take the average of the x's and you take the average of the y's. Just like when you're trying to find the average in a class, you add up all your scores and you divide by how many there are. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to add up our x's, which we only have 2 of them. These are our x's. And we're going to add up our y's, which again, we only have 2 of them. And we're going to find the average. So the midpoint of x is both of the x's added together and then divided by 2, because we're adding 2 numbers together. And just like I said, when you're finding your average of your scores, you add up all your scores. Let's say you had 7 scores. So you add up all 7 and then you divide by 7. But we only had 2 scores, so we're dividing by 2. So our first x coordinate was 2, and then our second x coordinate was -1. And then we're going to divide by 2 again because we only had 2 scores. 2 plus -1 is 1. And then we have divided by 2. Well, 1 divided by 2 is a half. So there's our first answer. Okay. So far, we're halfway there. Then we have to find the midpoint of the y's. And it's the same concept. You know, we're going to take the first y coordinate and we're going to add the second y coordinate and we're going to divide by 2. And the only reason it's a 2 is because we only had 2 coordinates to add together. And if you look up here, it was 3 and -1. So 3 and -1. So 3 plus -1 is 2, and you can check these in your calculator. 3 plus -1 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we are really close to being done. All we have to do now is put it all together. So our midpoint for our x value is 1/2. And our midpoint for our y value is 1. So that means that the midpoint lies on coordinate 1/2, 1. So let's go ahead and plot that point and we'll see if we agree. So let's go over 1/2. So that would be right about here and then up 1. Yeah, probably if I drew a little better. Yeah, it looks pretty close. I would agree with that. That is definitely the midpoint between those 2 points. And so the formula is actually really easy. So we're going to write down the formula. So the midpoint formula. So add both of your x values together and then divide by 2 and get that answer. And that'll be your x coordinate. Then add both of your y values together and divide by 2. And that'll be your y coordinate. And then you keep them, you know, in the coordinate points, like x, y. And that equals your midpoint, your x midpoint, and your y midpoint. So this is all together. All right, let's do one more example and then we'll move on to a worksheet in the next video. Okay, let's draw another coordinate plane and we'll make it 5 again. Hopefully you're better at this than me, and maybe yours actually will be closer to being accurate here. My hash marks are all over the place. All right, let's put one over here. Let's go 3, 3. Okay, -3, +3. And let's put one, how about right here? So over 5, down 1. So our two coordinate points are -3, +3, and +5, -1. We went over 5, down 1. We went -3, up 3. Okay, so the formula says to take the x's and add them together, and then divide by 2. Then take the y's, add them together, and then divide by 2. So I'm going to highlight my x's in one color, and I'm going to highlight my y's in a different color. I don't know how dark this is going to be. It's not bad. Okay. So -3 + 5 divided by 2. Then 3 + -1 divided by 2. So notice where I got my numbers, -3 and +5 for my x's, and +3 and -1 for my y's. Now I'm going to move up, and I still have this in the parentheses here. So -3 + 5. I'm going to do that in my calculator. -3 + 5. Then I hit enter. That's 2 over 2. And then I have 3 + -1, and that's also 2. This is going to be interesting. 2 over 2. Well, 2 over 2 is 1. Anything over itself is 1. So my coordinates are going to be 1, 1. So let's plot it and let's see what it looks like. So I go over 1 and up 1. That's pretty close. I would say that's definitely the midpoint. That looks halfway in between those 2 points. So it's not bad. You're going to be fine. You just have some practice problems to do. If you have any questions or if you don't understand, raise your hand and ask for help.